guys! Welcome to Quilting Window. I'm Edyta Sitar from Laundry Basket Quilts. I look forward to spend some time with you, and today we're gonna play with some mini scraps. So grab a little handful of scraps and let's make a mini quilt. I have a quilting basket for you. The basket doesn't have a lot of things because for minis we really don't need much. A little handful of scraps, that's what you need. And if you wanted to, you can visit our website for kids for this little quilt. This is the quilt that we're gonna be making today, a little flying geeses. It's super cute, small. So I have a little handful of scraps. Those little pieces are 5-inch squares. So if you have a little charm pack, you can work with that today. I also have a backing, binding, and a border in one piece. But if you have a handful of scraps laying, you really don't need much for a border or binding for this particular quilt. So those are the fabrics. When you're working with small quilts, I recommend a nice small ruler because when you're cutting small pieces, it really is nice to have a smaller ruler. And I like the Creative Grits rulers, those are fun. We're also gonna use Aurifil thread, and my favorite color is the 2370. It works with all of the fabrics. It's great with lights, it's great with darks, it's gonna work great for piecing, and it's a weight 50, so it's not gonna build up a lot of bulk in our seams. I love it. A small pair of scissors are always nice and handy, and a nice needles for your sewing machine, and I like the Macrotex needle. I use them for a lot of different things. So that's our quilting basket for today. And we also gonna need a little pattern. The pattern that we're working on it called Paula. From that pattern, we're gonna get the directions for cutting, and those are just the tiny little mini patterns that you can again find it on our website. So I'm gonna take my fabrics and I'm gonna cut. And when I cut my fabrics from all the lights, I like to cut squares. Those are my little squares. And I'm gonna cut them in half once diagonally to make a half square triangles. How do I cut my half square triangle? I first cut a square, then I take my ruler, I match my ruler's line. Right here you have that middle line, the 45-degree line. I'm gonna match it up with the edge of my fabric, and then I'm gonna cut it. Now I have a half square triangle. When in a pattern the measurements call for 1 7/8, I like to cut it a little bit bigger because I know I'm going to be making a little flying geese units and I want to have area to trim. So always remember that. But if you are accurate sewer and you have an excellent 1/4-inch seam allowance, cut exactly the measurements that I recommend in a pattern. On the other hand, need a little bit room to trim it, so what I do is cut my square at 2 inches, then cut it once diagonally, and I get half square triangles. What's so special about half square triangles? This is a straight grain, this is a straight grain, and this arm right here has a bias. What it means, it has a little bit of a stretch. This is really important to cut it because you don't want to have ever bias on the outside of your block, on the outside of your row, or on the outside of your quilt. So always bias on the inside. Once I have finished cutting, then my lights, I'm gonna proceed into cutting my dark fabric. And my dark fabric, I cut a square, and from that square this time, I'm gonna cut twice diagonally to 4/4 square triangles. 1/4 square triangles are a little bit different than half square triangles. 1/4 square triangles have only one side that have a straight grain and 2 sides have bias edges. Those are going to be our flying geeses. All right, I have cut enough fabric. Now I can go ahead and start sewing. I take my first flying geese and I take my background triangle. I'm gonna grab my flying geese and place it in my hand. I'm gonna put my triangle right over it, just like this. I'm gonna match the edges and match the point right here. Start sewing with a 1/4-inch seam allowance. straight down. I will repeat this over and over to have 24 flying geeses. This is how many I need for the whole quilt. So I repeat it 24 times. I love chain sewing. It is so much fun. As soon as I finish, I'm gonna push the seam allowance towards the dark. Notice, push seam allowance towards the dark. And I'm gonna separate my triangles with my cute little pair of scissors, one after the other. Just separate them like this. Now they are ready for the second step. Did you notice that I pushed my seam allowance towards the dark? Now this is interesting. When you learn how to quilt, you are taught to push your seam allowance towards behind the darker fabric to hide it. But next triangle, I want to break that rule. I want you to think about how I can use this seam allowance towards my advantage. And because I wanted to use a cute little tool, this is a block lock. It's a flying geese little tool. So because I wanted to use that tool, I'm gonna need that seam allowance to lock my tool in place. So the second seam, I grab my unit, I'm gonna place my triangle right over. I'm gonna start sewing, and again, you can start sewing from here down, or you can flip this whole unit and start sewing straight. When you start sewing from this point, I usually worry not to come across that seam, so my preference would have been to start from here straight down, and I hope you follow that lead. And I would repeat this 24 times, so I get 24 flying geeses, and as soon as I'm done, look at this, I'm gonna this time push my seam allowance towards the light. Why did I do that? Because I would like to take my little block lock flying geese tool, place it over, and notice it. When I push my tool, it locks right here, the seam allowance, and I can grab a lovely rotary and trim it. Trim. Ooh, perfect. Love it. Look at, I take this off. I don't like to cross my hands, so I reline everything. It would be nice if I have those spinning tables. Maybe you have one of those. Then it's nice for trimming and you can use it. I'm gonna put one of those on my Christmas list. Maybe I get it from my Santa. And now I just trimmed it. I'm also gonna go to the back, and there is a pluses and minuses with trimming this little bunny ears. Now notice, if I trim this bunny ear right here, then as I sew, there is like almost a bump, like a step down. So sometimes I like to leave that one because it gives me a smoother sewn down. Now I have few of those made, and I needed 24 for the whole quilt, and I'm gonna line them up to have fun with some of the colors, and I'm gonna start sewing them together just by taking two right sides together and sew it with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. When you're sewing it, pay attention to these lines right here. You do not want to take off any of the tips on your flying geeses. You want to be right on a line, and this is an example that I'm a little bit too far away. I should have been sewing and paying more attention that I hit it right here. So I want to be right next to my point, but not on it, because later on I want to have room to stitch in a ditch and do beautiful quilting, and my quilting is not gonna cover my lovely point here. So remember, you want to be close to it but not right on it. So sew those flying geeses together, practice, use your pins if you need to. I just place one next to the other and sew them beautifully into the rows. Once you have your rows completed, all of your rows would go in the same direction, then it's time to sew it into the quilt. You take the middle row and you flip the middle row in the opposite. Remember, when you are sewing your pieces, you're pushing your seam allowance between the flying geeses towards the top, towards the beak of a flying geese. Now, when I took my middle row and flipped it, all of those points gonna lock for me beautifully. And now the next thing, I'm gonna sew my rows, open the seams, at the right and the left of my borders, and my quilt top is complete. As soon as I complete my quilt top, it's gonna be time to layer with backing, bedding, and do a little bit of quilting. And let's talk about quilting before I let you go. You can quilt in a ditch right here just 5 times. So this seam, this, so it's 1, 2, 3, 4 times. I'm sorry. 4 times. So you could just quilt right here. If you want to go a little bit more, you could go ahead and weave yourself with quilting, going up on the flying geeses and quilt all the way to the top, then end up going back down, and that would outline all your flying geeses and pop your design a little bit more to the front. If you wanted to put an overall quilting of stippling, a little fun quilting, I used a block on my long arm machine, and I quilted right over with a pretty digitized block, then add a touch of a binding as an accent, and my little mini is complete. Thank you for joining me today for Little Mini. Please remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel, visit us on Facebook and Instagram, and on our website at www.laundrybasketquilts.com. I'm so looking forward to see you, what you're going to do with your little handful of scraps. Happy quilting!